kind of interesting because this one will probably be the last of the weekly live streams that we do. Certainly this year. But actually, probably won't be the last one we do because I do intend to do them, but not of a Wednesday night anymore because I'm hoping that we can go back to physical classes next year and very early next year. So keep an eye out for that. Anyway, tonight we're going to look at Fighting Dirty with Sabre. So we're going to do our final in the series of lessons on Chambon and what he said to do to fight dirty with Sabre. This time we're going to look at what to do if you're up against an opponent with only a sabre, like if you're in a fight with someone who's just got a sabre and not any other weapon. What Chambon does say is that a lot of what he described in terms of sabre and scabbard use is something that you do when you don't have a revolver. So, you've run out of ammunition, the revolver's jammed or failed, or he basically says whether it's either, I think the phrase he uses is either expended or unsuitable, which I don't know what unsuitable means. But my suspicion is what he means is that, you have your sabre in one hand and your revolver in the other. And then, once you've fired all of your shots with your revolver, you bust it, you get your scabbard out, which I guess kind of makes some of the discussion from last week where we were talking about, how are you meant to deploy all of this a bit more confusing, because my assumption was that what Chambon expected was that you would take the scabbard off the belt when you were going into battle, before, you were seeing any violence. But if he's expecting that you use your revolver in your offhand up until the point where it's expended, then presumably put it away and get the scabbard out, who knows? I mean, there's every possibility that this is just not something that he thought of. I think it is very, very important to remember that the people writing these manuals are fallible human beings just like the rest of us, and we should really extend them the same sort of charity and just understanding that we extend to anyone and go, okay, maybe you just didn't think of it. Maybe it's like there isn't a plan. He just just wasn't. It's just something that occurred to him. In the same way that this live stream started late because my dinner arrived late, mostly because I didn't think to order dinner until much closer to when the live stream started. Or that also was late. So it might simply be that. What he does also say, which I think is quite interesting, is that the relationship between sabre fencing in the cell and sabre fencing in the field, on the battlefield, is very, very similar to the relationship between foil and épée, where someone who is very skilled at épée can still be defeated very skilled at foil can still be defeated by a mediocre épée fencer. Just by virtue of the fact that the training for épée is much more comprehensive and much more detailed, much better. He says the same thing with basically with sabre. There is the sabre you do at the cell, which he says you also use for dueling, incidentally. So it's not like it's completely academic or and then needs to be applied. There is a simulation aspect to sabre training where it's perfectly good for a duel, but it's not so useful for sort of these kinds of military applications, battle applications. This is the first manual where I've ever read anyone say something like that, and this is a manual published in 1911. So whether this represents the first more research and application based approach for fencing, coming right at its twilight as a martial discipline, or whether this is just a thing, or whether this is a facet of the fencing of the day being more and more orientated towards the fencing cell, so essentially more orientated towards sport and leisure, and Chambon trying to reclaim some of the practical application is a matter for debate. It's a matter for as they say, pub discussion. Which actually we're having one. We'll have one of those next week, because next week we have our Christmas party. So what does Chambon say to do with, now, well, in this case it's stick, but with the scabbard and sabre when you're fighting field. He doesn't actually say what to do with the sabre and revolver. He just says that, it's the primary thing you do when you've got, when you're running around with a sabre. What's interesting, he doesn't mention the revolver right up until the section on how to deal with someone with just a sabre. And the other thing he says about dealing with someone with just a sabre is that it's a lot rarer than pretty much all the other stuff he's discussed. He says, if you're fighting someone with a sabre, they're more likely to be on horseback than they are to be on foot. You're most likely, and I think in Chambon's world, the order in which the manual is written is the order of likelihood of who you're going to face. So so you're most likely to face someone with a bayonet. You're more, I think in his view, I get the impression in his view, you're more likely to face someone with a lance than you are with a sabre on horseback. Also, lance on horseback. And then the thing you're least likely to have to deal with that he talks about in the manual is someone armed just with a sabre who you're encountering on foot, which I find quite interesting, just in terms of his own expectations. So let's get into it, look at the techniques. As has become the custom at this point in the live streams, I'm not really expecting anyone to follow along anymore, just because, these are sort of working better as information delivery rather than as a follow-along lesson. And also just, a lot of people, I guess I'm thinking of these as much as a resource for future, for people watching the video and then going away and training rather than training whilst the video is happening. Especially now that lockdown has kind of ended, we could, the reason we haven't done physical classes is more about me needing to get a venue rather than, any sort of legal restriction. So here we go. But if you have any comments or any questions, anything else you just want to add, chuck it down in the comment section and I will get to it as quickly as I can. And I have a larger screen that I'm looking at now, so I can actually kind of see your comments from here, hopefully. We'll see. Anyway, so first bit of advice that Chambon gives about fighting in the field is he says you're primarily going to be attacking the sword arm. This is not that abnormal for French sabre fencing in general, but even particularly actually for most of the 19th century and the 20th. In Valville, who's writing in about around 100 years before, just posted Napoleonic Wars, Valville said, the first thing he teaches after the guards is attacks to the arm. With Jules Jacob, who's writing, he's writing the late 1870s and sort of moving towards the 1880s. He says, if you ever find yourself in a sabre duel, as much as they are much rarer than épée duels, the primary thing you're going to be doing is attacking the sword arm because it's the only safe thing to do. Well, not the only safe thing to do, but the safest thing to do. If you go straight to the body, as far as Jules Jacob is concerned, you're risking a double hit, particularly if your opponent reflexively just sticks their point out because they're terrified of being in a duel. When you get to Chambon, Chambon says basically the same thing, that really, most of the time you're going to be particularly thrusting to the sword arm, although he says you can cut as well. Interesting, one thing he tends to emphasize quite a bit, particularly in this section, is throwing cuts in succession. So rather than just throwing a direct cut and then coming back to guard, he reckons you should throw multiple cuts, because he thinks that particularly with clothing and gear like bandoliers, webbing, that kind of thing, pouches of ammunition, stuff in the front, the effectiveness of a cut is going to be reduced, which, when he's a bit more specific about what he means by that, he's not saying it won't injure a person, but more that it won't injure them enough to incapacitate them, which I find really, really interesting, because you hear about accounts of saber duels where someone is injured but keeps going until it becomes apparently that the injury is going to stop them. One case I find really interesting where it was a saber duel, I think in the United States, where someone got cut, one of the participants got cut on the thumb by the sword just sort of coming around the guard. It hit them on the guard, and cut them on the thumb, and they're like, well, this is not a substantive enough wound to stop. So they kept going up until the point where they struck their opponent in the head, at which point their saber went flying out of their hand because their thumb was too injured to actually hold on to the saber, so they only did a very, very minor cut to their opponent's head, at which point things were called off. One thing that I find quite useful about this retracted guard Chambon has in terms of attacking is it's very, very easy to deliver a very fast, aggressive sort of lashing attack. I personally find cuts from here a lot easier. I think, to thrust, you really need to come to a more conventional guard and then lunge. But certainly attacks to the arm are very vital. One of the things as well I kind of wonder, because he's not very specific about what attacks he recommends, just that you'll do them, is if you can't use this to come over the guard, and even keep your scabbard a bit extended, or just bring your scabbard out a bit as a way of covering your arm in the attack. So when I attack, what I do is I extend to come to basically a prime position, and then thrust. And remember, this is a move to position thrust. I don't want to be trying to reach that position in flight, because then it becomes far too easy for me to not get my point online in time and just tap the other person in the forearm and do like nothing. So I bring my saber online and then thrust. And when I thrust, I extend out my scabbard as a way basically of stopping my opponent from countercutting my arm, just like slipping and countercutting, which is something that Chambon says you can do as well, which is kind of cool. So just to show you that again from the front, I extend to the position and thrust. Lunge is optional. I, as a quite tall person who often don't need to lunge, if you're a similar height and reach to your opponent, you can sometimes get away without lunging, depending on how close they like to fight. If you're shorter than your opponent, you're going to need to lunge. That's the breaks. But same idea. I come online, I thrust, and I think when you're training this, when you're practicing this, as much as your goal should be to get it to be some movement, you want to practice it phased first, specifically the tip on line and then extend with the scabbard. Because one, you don't want to do this as just kind of a wrapping tack kind of shot. Especially swords are actually really not good at doing those. Don't know why, because with wrapping shots with a stick are perfectly fine. I suspect most is a product of just the balance of the sword being so low. And also the flex. Swords are very, very sideways flexible. So you can't really do wrapping shots with them with any kind of efficacy. What you can do is bring your tip online and then extend out and cover yourself. And you notice the other thing I'm doing, to the side, to cover myself is I'm actually making a cross here, so there's a lot of structural strength. So I don't really need to worry about defending down on sort of the forte of my scabbard, down close to him where I have more leverage to stop the blow, because I've got, I basically reinforced it up here with my own shell, which is extra good. It means I don't have to extend my hand too much, which could leave me vulnerable to being countercut in the hand, especially against an opponent who is maybe familiar with this kind of trickery. So that is your primary way of sort of thrusting the hand and taking advantage of the scabbard as well. Obviously, you can cut, you can just snap out, and this is really just. Initially, with this, it is a lot easier to turn your hand in flight, mostly because my hand, my edge is pretty much online before I've gone anywhere near full, like before even half extension, like I'm here, I'm on line here, I'm half extended here, full extended here. So I can just fire it out, or fire it up with like a quick step, like a Denny lunge. I'm putting my foot forward, 1 foot width and 1 foot width alone. So yeah, that's advice. The reason for that being, the reason why you attack the arm from a fencing perspective. So a lot of people talk about, oh, you disable the arm, you disable the weapon, and there's kind of this sort of very injury-centric kind of or damage-dealing model that we analyze this stuff with. But that's not the reason you go to the arm or you attack the sword hand. The reason you attack the sword hand is that to defend the body, or a person can slip and counter if they've got good control of distance, or slip and counter and double and kill you as well in the process of dying if they don't, which is the latter being significantly more likely. And also getting control to go to the body is quite difficult, depending on how much fencing experience you have. Whereas going to the sword arm, lashing out is generally ineffective because actually like lashing out and trying to hit someone in their own sword arm as they come in is really hard. It's a small target. It is very often protected by the shell. It's also, just at the max, it's usually at just the extent of your reach, and it's only there for the briefest of seconds, whereas the body, the body is in sort of position to be stabbed for much longer. So they can't go your sword hand very easily. They can't go your body very easily because your body is too far away. Like, if my opponent was standing at the wall, they'd have to go a much shorter distance to hit me in sword arm, even in the guard, than they would to go to my body. So it's safe from that perspective. And it's also safer because the main way you defend, or to defend, you either need to parry or just pull your arm out of the way. If a person pulls their arm out of the way, which a lot of people will do instinctively, it gives you a much, much bigger window to then get away. So it's a much, much safer place to go. And this is why you see this as a motif in French sabre repeatedly, where, I guess contrary to kind of, frankly, at this point, quite obnoxious stereotypes, French martial arts are incredibly practical, particularly their sabre. Foil's it's practical for its purposes, a fun game for people to play and gamble over, but not so much in terms of combative effectiveness. But everything else, like their sabre, things like scabard, defense dance, leroux, and whatnot, very, very practical systems of defense and very orientated to what is the highest percentage or most useful technique. So again, if you're going to attack the forearm from your guard, bring your tip along, and then extend out and cover with your scabbard, or just flick out straight down on kind of a Denny lunge. This is assuming, of course, someone is in a Tierce guard. Incidentally, if they are not, if you've got someone who's doing basically the same thing back to you, which is not in the manual does not say what happens if you've got someone who's basically fighting you the same way you're fighting them. The other thing you can do to attack the forearm is stab basically at the elbow, or I recommend just above the elbow, aim about here, and a quick poke to there can be quite dangerous because this guard is necessary to facilitate the use of the scabbard as an offhand weapon, but in of itself, I wouldn't do this without the scabbard. It's got a lot of vulnerabilities as well. Right. So moving on. Next thing, Chambon says in terms of attacks, he says thrusting are going to be your main attack, and you need to do them with a lot of vigor and veracity and probably other things that start with V, but the other word that comes to my mind is commitment. He says you should be very aggressively committed if you're thrusting, particularly if you're thrusting to the body. Actually, definitely if you're threatening anybody, you should be deeply committed to the thrust. So you want to basically fire your sword out and launch yourself forward as quickly as possible. Just to run through quickly, the motion for thrusting from this guard is I come down to bring my sword in line, I extend, lunge, retract. I don't want to, be trying to go straight to extension from this really high guard. I certainly don't want to be bringing my tip online in flight, because that's a really, really good way to slap my opponent with my tip, or at best case scenario, to turn a thrust into a crappy cut. I want to bring my sword in line, extend, lunge, retract. Sword in line, extend, lunge, retract. Sword on line, extend, lunge, retract. But in terms of doing this, learning to do it explosively is really, really important. Contrary to what people will tell you, there's no technique explanation from taking, a basic lunge like this. It could be done, and often is done quite cautiously, particularly by new offences. The technique is similar enough that just saying do the technique better is not helpful. The two things that help you develop a really explosive thrust, one is physical training, fitness, so doing a lot of particularly explosive things for explosive footwork. Kettlebells are quite good, plyometrics are quite good. HIIT classes, HIIT classes, high interval, high intensity training classes, becoming quite popular with people who do Olympic fencing, where they want to have these big explosive lunges. I do actually wonder if the emphasis on explosivity is actually an indication, or is an indication of the early stages of the transition between 19th century fencing and 20th century fencing, or really pre-World War I and post-World War I fencing, because that actually seems to be more the dividing point than the turn of the century. But history is never, it doesn't have clean delineations. Everything is a spectrum that you just kind of label specific points on as a way of making it understandable. The other thing that you want to do to develop explosive lunges, or like the commitment, is just get used to impact and shock, get used to basically the idea that you're going to crash into things, and that's okay. In terms of doing that, boxing is both very, very good and very, very fun, just in terms of getting used to being smacked in the face. I've been told rugby helps. I have never played rugby, so I don't know, but anything where you're crashing into people, I imagine a lot of the HMB guys would have no problems from the perspective of I'm just going to explode at the other person. Actually, if you watch a lot of HMB pro fights, that's literally what they do on a number of occasions. Really, any HMB, just get in armor, explode at the other person, just blow, rocket yourself into your opponent is the order of the day. But yeah, so that's the way you train those, is do some fitness, do some kettlebells, and do something so that you don't instinctively flinch. So find that actually, if you're fencing and you're having trouble feeling like you can come forward, like if you've got very quick footwork in terms of moving backwards or laterally, just find that you're really hesitant coming forward, that's a sign that it might not be a footwork issue so much as you're flinching in a very small way that's slowing you down. So yeah, next thing that Chambon says about attacks is, he says with cuts, you want to do them multiple times. He says you want to do them in combinations basically. The reason for this is he says that cuts are less effective at wounding the opponent. I have a strong suspicion that this is a product of the sorts of swords or sabers he's using. He's not specific as to why he thinks this. He just says it's like it's an observable truth. So who knows? But when you're doing this, when you're cutting with this weapon system, and I think regardless of what other fencing you do, a lot of the things that Chambon does, nearly anything that is completely idiocentric to his system, is something that you'll end up doing fighting. Something you'll end up doing regardless of what Sabre system you do if you take up a scabbard in the offhand. What he says to do, is you start starting from your guard, you launch your cut, and then you just maul back at your opponent. This is also why I think he emphasised, he says only go deep when you have good control. He also says not to do it on a riposte. He says you can riposte, although better with a thrust, but you can't, he says, but otherwise he says you can't play parry riposte like you can in the cell. And I actually think this is a big reason why he's expecting you to deliver multiple cuts, where you will fire and cut again. So I come to my cut position, I lunge in, and I cut again before I recover. So basically doing those as an extended delay. So from my cut position, I fire out, cut, retract. Cut, retract. And something you'll note about this if you've done any fencing with me, in 19th century fencing, consecutive attacks are generally frowned on. I don't like them in principle because I think that in most instances, when you do them, you rely very heavily on the compliance of your opponent. In fact, I think that's true of all instances. It's just sometimes the way you get that compliance is by recognizing patterns in your opponent. But unless you can really do that, consecutive attacks really are very, very dangerous. The second attack will usually result in double hit. The only time it doesn't is if the opponent doesn't riposte or launch any kind of counterattack. But in Chambon's case, he has a clever way around this, namely scabbard. So when Chambon says use the scabbard for a few things, one is to beat the opponent's sword aside. In contrast to what I said last week, he does actually mention scabbard attacks to the body. He doesn't say anything about it. It's just he says attacks to the line is something to the effect of when you are doing attacks to the body with scabbard, or he said avoid attacks to the body with sabre or scabbard, and that's it. He just says don't he says basically only do them when you're completely safe. When I say avoid that, he goes on to say he then goes on to explain the times when you can do them. But he means avoid is don't do it as your basic, not don't do it ever. Obviously, there are times he recommends you do it. But one of the first ways that and then when he goes on to describe what you do with scabbard, it's almost always to get control of your opponent's sword somehow. So the first way he has of that is through beating, through basically striking your opponent's sword with your scabbard. So if it helps you all imagine the mechanics of this, remember that Chambon is assuming that your opponent is standing like this in a tierce guard and doesn't have a scabbard of their own. They're not doing his guard, where this probably would not quite as well. But all I do is to strike, I just basically punch out. So I'm extending my arm, I'm letting the tip of the scabbard drift back, which I'll just stick around so that it's got a bit more weight towards the head. When I extend, I'm letting the tip drift back so that it can then fire forward at the end of the punch extension. So I'm punching out. You want to think of this as punch and whip, much the same way as you do with your sabre when you just do a normal cut and any direct attack. Punch and whip. Same idea here. This is for not necessarily for reasons of opposition, the way I normally explain it for those who've come to my lessons. This is primarily for power generation. Is you're rocketing things forward, but you're actually basically cocking the scabbard as you bring your hand forward to then fire it out. So punch and whip. Punch and whip. punch and whip. And of course, the goal of this is to knock your opponent's sword aside so that you have an opening. In terms of the tactics that this allows for, don't think of this as I'm smashing my opponent's sword so wide that they'll be, that it'll be so far away, it'll be miles away, so when they come in, I can just hit them. Think of this as I am forcing my opponent to react to me. So, your opponent on guard has their sword smacked. It's now moving offline. It's in another position, and in order to react to that, they have to bring their sword. They have to move this, either defend from that position, or move their sword back to a guard. And a lot of the point of beats, particularly because they tend to drive your sword or knock your sword so that the flat, it's the blade or edge, neither the edge or points on line, is that they give you a moment where your opponent has to recover before they can make a reasonable attack. Like one of the advantages of doing a beat and an attack ends just regular saber. A beat and an attack, because my opponent has to defend in a way that recovers from the beat, and can't counterattack, which gives me not so much an opening to attack into, but a tempo, a point in time where my opponent can't attack me. It's less than a second, but that's more than enough for me to launch my own attack without worrying about being counterattacked by my opponent. And it's the same idea here. I throw a beat, punch out the beat, so I can then throw my proper attack whilst my opponent is recovering from the beat. And like I said, these are, as much as you should do with a lot of vigor and energy, don't think of this as, bashing your opponent's sword out of the way. You'll notice that the attack is mostly forward. It's more about displacing and moving them to another position. And it can honestly be as subtle as that. And I also find if you really try and push them sideways, there's every chance that they will use that energy to come back online very quickly, which ruins the point of the beats. The other way you can use this tactically, the other way you can use beats generally, if they're just done with the saber, is you can use this as a way of making your opponent back off. If your sword is driven offline, so if I'm just doing saber, my sword is suddenly popped to the side, I might back up just to give myself more time to recover, a bit more safety. So if you've got an opponent that's bearing in on you, they're being quite aggressive, you don't like how close they are, you just tap them with the saber, just give them a bit of a beat as a way of making them a little bit more reluctant to come in. And if they're being particularly aggressive, like they're trying to get really close before launching your attack, doing a beat, seeing what happens, and if they continue to be aggressive, beat and attack means you can actually make them walk onto your point, which is kind of cool. So the next thing Chambon says to do is to cover with the scabbard. This is not a beat. The motion is a little similar, but not the same. I think when I initially saw it, I assumed that he was talking about a beat when there's actually a separate motion he's talking about where you cover. So the idea is, I'm on guard, my opponent is also on guard, I extend, I basically come out to this position where I've got control of my opponent's sword. This sword is sitting somewhere around here. And as soon as I get contact, I bring my sword down and thrust. The idea being that not only have I driven them offline so they can't actually hit me, but I've also created an opening where it's going to be very, very hard for them to get their sword across to attack me. And you'll notice when I do this from the front, extend, thrust. I'm thrusting, even though my opponent's sword will be somewhere over here, I'm thrusting in tiers. So I'm thrusting in complete absence with my sword. And the reason for that is, well, for one, I'm not using my sword for defense at all because I've got the scabbard for that. But for two, that actually puts as much space as I can reasonably get between my opponent's sword and mind to make it as hard for them to parry as possible. Like if they react by, retreating and recovering, they're going to still have to come a really, really long way in order to successfully defend this. In terms of doing this technique, when you do it, make sure that you don't turn your body. You want to keep your body straight. That's probably the big difference in the movement between beat, where I bring my hip forward and I even raise my heel a little bit to make it very punchy, and just covering is I'm just extending, and I actually want my body to stay side on. So what I don't want is a situation where I extend out, cover, and then lose that cover as I come in. I don't want to then change my scabbard position and pull it backwards as I come in, because that can also, it could potentially get my opponent, or give my opponent an opening to get the sword free and stab each. I don't like being stabbed. I mean, I say I do fencing, so I don't mind it terribly much, but if it results in actual squishy death, not a thing I'm very, very fond of. And I find with this, if you're at home and you've got a mirror or you're live streaming, you can see yourself on television, or something where you can see yourself front on, practicing to minimize torso turn is really, really important to getting the hang of this. Just in terms of making sure you do this correctly, you're getting control and coming in. If you've got a partner, do this drill and have your partner basically be pushing against you. Once you get contact, have them push aggressively against your scabbard or forcefully against the scabbard the entire time, because that will force you to adjust your scabbard position to make sure that one, the sword isn't going to slip down, two, that you've got to have enough leverage to have control, and three, that you're not losing control at any point, because you'll be able to see it from the pressure of their sword moving across. So that can be a really, really good drill in terms of doing this. The final thing that Chambon says in terms of using the scabbard is to cut, is to cross or to cover. So what I do is I come on guard. From the guard position, you can start your right to the guard. Particularly if I'm parrying, I come to this cross position. So I reach out and actually cross. And this isn't like a straight cross. I'm not expecting that my opponent's pressure, force, pushingness, they're basically, whatever. Like if you imagine my opponent pushing forward to try and drive the cross out of the way, I don't want to think of that as coming in right at the intersection. I want to think of that as still coming in against probably the scabbard. I want to think of them pushing primarily at the scabbard, but with the sword as a guide to help displace them. A lot of people complain about cross blocks not working in Filipino martial arts or other martial arts when they're doing these kinds of things. But the reason for that is that everyone thinks of it as I'm blocking with the intersection of the cross, which you're not. When you do it, you're blocking with one of the limbs and then using the other one for security. Basically, I'm expecting my opponent's sword to hit, or my opponent's attack to intersect with this arm. I come sliding up this arm and then crash into this other arm here. And same deal with this. When I'm doing this, I'm expecting my opponent's sword to come sliding up my sword and crash into my saber. And the cross is more just there as a way of making it harder for them to escape. As a way of forcing them basically to have to go very, very far away, very, very far, in order to actually, in order to escape the cross. Obviously from here, when I get my cross position, I can expel and countercut, I can push wide. I can push my opponent's sword really wide with this. So unlike with a beat where the energy will help them come back, they're going to have to move their sort of really long way to get around my scabbard. So I do this. I come to this position, I flick, and come round, and I can push them all the way out there to create a giant opening, which is quite useful. Because like to come back, they can't just they have to come a really, really long distance. The other thing that I can use this for is to close. And one thing Chambon actually says is that if you're facing someone who's not very good or not very confident with their sabre, or not very good with their sabre, the two things that they're liable to do that you have to be very, very wary for is that they'll either just try and shoot you with their revolver, or particularly if they do know how to use sabre and scabbard, sorry, they're not particularly confident with their sabre, but they've been told, hey, you can use the scabbard as an offhand weapon. Just like the only time he actually talks about this as a thing that could happen, which I find really interesting. I just find it really bizarre that there is a manual which assumes complete asymmetry the entire time. Like even most manuals that are scenario based still start with a equal weapons, equal systems, and then here's what to do against, not that. Whereas this manual is just there's one mention of the idea that your opponent might do the same, be trying the same basic thing, trying to use the same weapon combination against you. What he says is that they will rush you, which makes sense. Just because someone's a good fencer doesn't mean they know how to wrestle or kick or anything like that. And Fucci says familiarizing yourself with kicks is helpful. So what he means is I am I'm in my guard position, I cross, or my opponent crosses and comes in this position here. And what you need to do is one of two kicks. The first is basically I slide my foot on the ground and do kind of a soccer kick. And what I'm doing is driving the edge of my boot. If you think of even a modern boot has, sort of like a centimetre, half a centimetre to a centimetre of, dense rubber sole. Historic, boots used in Chambon's period, this was pressed leather, so really solid, like the same kind of hard leather that gets used for armour. Basically, you're driving essentially something that's the hardness of a piece of wood into someone's shin, and you're flicking, and the flick and the counterweight of your body generates a lot of power. So this is obviously not going to debilitate anyone. Anyone claiming that this will break someone's shin is exaggerating, but what it will do is disrupt them enough that you can then follow through and do other things. So from here, flick motions, I'm riding my foot on the floor and flicking up, and I basically want to sort of counterweight with my body, which is really, really hard, but I'm also trying to look at the camera to make sure that the sound's coming through. It essentially looks something like this. I'm getting a lot of my way into it. And if this done correctly, it can be delivered with a reasonable amount of force. Again, not going to break anything. This is not a knockout in itself or anything like that. But this is a disruption where you're disrupting your opponent's balance. And then also, because the counterweight means you can push forward, you can then use that as a way of pushing forward and actually just balancing them to then come loose and just to create an opening what you can then hit them with. So that's option number one in terms of kicks. Option number two is a kick I think I've done previously, but let's just do it again. Where I come to this cross position, I raise my leg up, kick in, aiming at somewhere above the knee, somewhere between the knee and the hip. I've been told that the crease of the hip is a really great place to hit with this, because if you can flex someone's hip, you can really drive them off balance. But really anywhere along here is quite good. And then coming back. So I'll show you that from the front. Actually put the weapons down. Oh, actually no, I'm going to do it because it's context specific. But from here, I come up. You can see how many foot is wide. I kick, and and come back. I'm basically stomping my heel, which in this case, a lot of boots had a steel plate on the heel, into my opponent's leg. But I'm also coming back. I want to bring my foot all the way back. I don't want to fall forward, because if I fall forward, I'm also off balance, especially if my opponent is going to be moving back up. Is probably going to be moving back, or at least stumbling backwards, which is what I want. Falling forward kind of kills a lot of the advantage of this. It also has the problem that if I miss, or if my opponent pulls their leg out of the way, if it slips, then all of a sudden I'm falling forward towards my opponent. I'm off balance and in a lot of danger of also being counter hit. So don't want to fall forward. It's not a good thing to do. Instead, I want to kick and arc my foot back. But that is, the two options Chambon gives you. The reason he doesn't suggest other kicks, so the reason he doesn't suggest like side kicks or even front kick type things, is basically because they cause you to lean back a lot more easily. And something that I've been discovering just playing with this system a bit is that this kind of kick is much better in the bind, because it means my torso remains more or less upright. Like I lean back a little, but it's a lot less. And my legs aren't really sore from deciding to go from not exercising for a bit too long because of celebrating the end of lockdown to going back to the full vigor of my lockdown exercise routine. I can do it without leaning forward at all. So yes, that's most of what Chambon advises to do against someone who's just got a Sabre. This is, it's an interesting system. I quite like it. I'd like to play with it more. I'm really tempted to see if I can get a fencing scabbard basically made up to give it a try. But yeah, that's kind of the whole deal. So anyway, that brings us to the end of the lesson for tonight. Before I finish up, this will be the last live stream for the year. Next week we are having Christmas drinks, so we'll be in the Temperance Society. And then after that, live streams will start when I start them again. I'm going to try and keep doing these, but when I do them, like the times under which I do them, is really I'm not sure of as of yet. I don't know what the plan is for next year. Particularly with Omicron, everything's a bit up in the air. But yeah, otherwise, I will hopefully see you, if not at in-person lessons next year, at the very least, when I resume online stuff. And yeah, before I go, are there any questions or comments or anything that anyone wants to ask? Just to see. Cool. Nick said he loved that kick target. I'm glad you like it. It's a fun thing, and it's something I realized as an option. I find it much better than just throwing the normal sorts of kicks you'd throw in like a kickboxing kind of context, because I don't have to counterweight my body near as much. So yeah, no, I've seen that. Yeah, it does really fold the body over, which is nice as well. Cool. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the live stream session. We are going to be meeting online after this just to chat and sort of catch up for the evening. So I'll post the details of that. You should be able to find the Zoom address in the event. So they'll be in the event description and also in the comments now, and just kind of really everywhere. And I'm going to try and launch Zoom now. And obviously, if you enjoyed these lessons, we really do appreciate any donations you can make. Like I said, we are starting up next year. One of the things that's kind of held us back is because we were only really breaking even when COVID hit, and we still had expenses. It's been a bit hard to actually put down a deposit and secure a venue. So yeah, any contributions you can make will be greatly appreciated. Expenses. It's been a bit hard to actually put down deposits and secure a venue. Cool. And yeah, other than that, I will see you next year. And have a good one.